This is more of an overview, and I think what you're going to see from this presentation is, first of all, an overview on Finland's educational system. Second of all, things that you can use as advocates for public education to explain why, in many ways, comparing the United States or comparing New Jersey and their educational performance to that of Finland is really a completely unfair comparison due to several cultural, financial, and specific country demographic issues associated with Finland that are very different from the United States. And in the third piece, there were some beliefs, some core beliefs, and some processes and aspects of their educational system that I do believe would translate to the United States. Unfortunately, they're going to be very heavy lifts for us as educators in order to implement and really start changing the public policy aspects of the United States and the state of New Jersey. Just a brief demographic overview. This is probably one of the first indications that you really can't compare a country such as the size of Finland to the United States. You're talking a population of roughly 5.2 million versus the United States of 316 million. Education, they spend roughly 6.8% of GDP versus the United States as a whole of 5.4%. That was in 2009. Although if you look at New Jersey actually ranks pretty close to where Finland is with regard to spending on education as a percentage of GDP. One of the major differences between the two education systems comes with regard to the demographics. And if you look at the top ethnicities there in Finland, you've got Finnish, Swedish, Russian, and Estonian, with basically roughly 99% of the population being made up of two specific demographic groups. You look at the United States, you look at New Jersey, you've got a significantly different and more widespread a variety among the demographics and diversity. Keep in mind, for some reason, as I was researching this, the U.S. Census Bureau does not specifically separate out Hispanic. For some reason, it's part of these other groups. But you've also got roughly 15% of Hispanic population that's intermingled within those groups that are listed there, which is also one of the fastest growing populations in the United States. Literacy rate, again, couldn't find anything specific on New Jersey measured the way that the countries measure, but you're looking at roughly comparative literacy rates. Another major difference, the migration rate. And the migration rate here on this slide is defined as the amount of people per 1,000 of population who are moving in or out of the country. And you can see from the Finland versus the United States a significant difference in terms of migration. And that has a significant impact on these public school systems in both countries because one country doesn't have to deal with the fact that they've got new people coming in or going out and the significant mobility, and whereas the United States does. And while that brings a significant amount of diversity, it brings a significant amount of increased learning opportunities from one another for our students, it also brings the challenges of English language learners and other challenges of integrating those students into our schools, into our cultures, in addition to just the overall transition, which, depending on what age that occurs for a child, could be rather significant and or traumatic. That migration rate also doesn't include any type of migration within the United States, between states or just naturally in and out of school systems. That's purely from the country's perspective. 3 facts to know about Finland. Number 1, Finland has not always been a high performer. If you go back 40 years and you compare Finland's educational performance to that of the rest of the world, you'll actually find that they lagged the rest of the world in educational performance. And over the last 40 years, they've not only been able to close that gap, but basically vault themselves up to be number 1 or number 2 in international rankings. Fact number 2, and this is very important in terms of culture of Finland. Finland never, ever aimed to be the best. In fact, we got the distinct impression that we were there, that once they were vaulted to the top over that 40-year span, they probably sat in the room just like you are now and said, okay, we've got all these phone calls coming in saying they want to visit us, and what did we do? What exactly did we do? We didn't get an impression that there was a clear strategic plan, that we wanted to be an international leader in education, that we wanted to have the best school system. But this also has an implication, and this was shared with us, this also has an implication for what we look at in the United States in terms of how we look at our school systems. Because if you're going to build a school system to be the best, you're going to look at specific metrics of how schools are measured. Just as an example, New Jersey Monthly. If you want the best high school, you're going to call up New Jersey Monthly and say, look, what are your rankings? What's your methodology? What do we need to do to get to the top of your list? And that sets a whole chain of reaction of events in place in districts and in states and in the nation in terms of how you build a school system. Because you're competing against some other set of external metrics and competing against other individual school districts. Rather, what Finland has set out to do is ask this question. We want to have a school system where pupil success doesn't depend on their home background. Now, when you think about that mission, that philosophy, that now starts to speak to a completely different way of building a school district. Because now you're looking at not how do we be the best, how do we have the best SAT scores, but how do we look at each individual child and ensure that they're going to be able to achieve as a 21st century worker, as a 21st century person, regardless of where they came from and their home background. So one of the lessons I think you take away from Finland is we need to think about how do we actually look at success and how do we measure success in the United States public schools? Is it about a race to the top? Is it about beating out the competition? Or is it truly about focusing on each individual child and what we can do to make them a success? Fact number 3, Finland does well overall. So you have to keep in mind, and there's some reasons for this which we'll get into, you have to keep in mind that when you look at an education system, that's a microcosm of their entire society. And you look at some of these different metrics which were shared with us by Pasi Sahlberg, you'll see that Finland ranks near the top in various categories, many of which have a direct correlation to education, such as, for example, the child poverty rate, child health and well-being, the income inequality rate, which we're going to spend a significant amount of time talking about as part of this presentation. So Finland overall does exceptionally well. Now, I asked the question of Pasi Sahlberg, who wrote the book, and if you're interested in learning more about Finland, I recommend the book Finnish Lessons by Pasi Sahlberg, S-A-H-L-B-E-R-G. And many of these slides you'll see cited are directly from his presentation to us. One of the things that I asked him was, well, look, can you correlate these metrics to the fact that you've improved your education system? Or has your education system improved as a result of these metrics improving? And his response to us was he hasn't drawn any correlation between the two. Not to mention some of these things are somewhat difficult to really assess concretely. For example, the unhappiness index. You know, when the budget comes out from the state, probably we're all ranked pretty low on the unhappiness index. Graduation, we're probably all ranked pretty high. So some of these things are less concrete than others. Cornerstones of the Finnish educational policy. Because they're not focused on competition, because they're not focused on beating one another, the Finland educational system is focused on long-term and consistent results. They're looking kind of almost like a Japanese Kaizen process, continuous improvement, formative assessments. How can we continually hone our craft? How can we professionally develop our teachers? How can we really provide additional support for education? A vision of a knowledge-based society. Teachers are widely valued and respected in Finland. It is a highly respected profession, which I think, unfortunately, in the United States is not so much so. Big difference there between the two countries. Responsibility and decision-making power at the local level. And we in New Jersey think that local is as local can get, given the fact that we have 500 school districts. When I say local, they believe in school-level empowerment. There are no direct school district school boards in Finland. What they have there is each school has the equivalent of what would be a school board. But that school board doesn't participate in the same level of decision-making that a school board that we're accustomed to. They only meet 3 or 4 times a year, and they're more focused on, again, the long-term and consistent results and driving the big picture, approving curriculum, and overall school strategy. So you're not looking at a very active body, you're looking at much more of a strategic body. Big culture of trust. There is no accreditation, there are no inspectors, there's no real assessment of schools. There's a big culture of trust that headmasters or principals and teachers are professional, they know what they're doing, and there's a commitment and a responsibility that they have to drive educational improvement. and equality and equity in education, which is a big part of the success that Finland has achieved. And as I said, we're going to get into that in a minute. The Global Education Reform Movement, or as they referred to it, GERM, and the Finnish way. And they talked about how, as globally we're reforming education, we're focusing on competition, things like Race to the Top. We're focusing on test-based accountability, test-based assessment, standardization, making sure that we approach everything the same way, and fear, whether it be from teacher evaluations, fear and pressure that we're putting on students with regard to testing. And you juxtapose that to the Finnish way where, as I mentioned, strong culture of collaboration, trust-based responsibility, high degree of trust in principals, high degree of trust in teachers and respect. Customization. They view special education, for example, much like we have a 504 plans in place for students. They don't see special education as the end itself. They see it as a means to an end. And a lot of their students have some degree of special education intervention as a part of educating the whole child. And well-being. Every student receives a free lunch every single day. Huge focus on the child, huge focus on developing the whole child. Diving into these aspects in the comparison a little further, standardization, we know what that means for the U.S. Flexibility and diversity, you've got school-based curriculum development. There's time built in for teachers to collaborate. Very laid-back culture. There's time built in for teachers to work professionally together. Broad-based knowledge versus literacy and numeracy. In the United States, we're focused on specifically achieving literary and numerical standards. There's a huge focus in Finland on developing the whole child. Arts is very important. Physical well-being is very important. Mental well-being is very important. And finally, trust through professionalism. As I indicated, there's no accreditation in Finland. There's really a culture of trust and professionalism that these people will be there and that they will do their jobs. Basic elementary education, it's provided free of charge, so they have very much a public school system. Hot lunch is included daily, so students do not have to pay for lunch. School year stretches to approximately 190 working days, starts in mid-August, it ends in early June. We figured out they're basically in school for roughly the same amount of time that we are. You're looking in the earlier years, 5 lessons of 45 minutes each, and then it goes up to 7 lessons of 45 minutes each, or 5 lessons of 75 minutes each, depending as you get to the upper levels. Approximate cost, and this was actually surprising, was $8,450 US for an elementary school student, which is somewhere near where New Jersey is, probably actually even on the low side for an elementary school student. When I talk about educating the whole child, one of the things that we had a chance to do is go visit an elementary school. And this is an elementary school in Porvoo. And again, this is probably one of the flagship ones. It was featured on 2020. And one of the reasons that it's a flagship school there is because they have a huge opportunity for students to really develop beyond just, as I said, literacy and numeracy. They have every single day what they call a 45-minute siesta, where students have an opportunity to participate in art, music, physical education, woodshop, theater. So some of the same things that we have in our elementary schools, such as art, music, and phys ed, but much more expanded and much more further developed than what I've seen here in New Jersey. Moving on to upper secondary education, and this is a key factor when you look at their educational results. Finland sorts their kids. So by the time you're ready to go to upper secondary education, half of the age group chooses an upper secondary school, and the other half continues to vocational studies. Now, when you look at their educational results that you see on the PISA are based on the half that choose to go to upper secondary school. So when you make a comparison between the United States and Finland, you have to keep that in mind that there's an entire cohort that is pursuing another option. Now, that probably would not translate well to the United States because going back to the whole migration rate. In Finland, you're basically dealing with a confined society. So the jobs are there. There's opportunities for vocational jobs. So a student pursuing a vocational career, because that is the full context of their ability, that's what their aptitude is in, there's nothing wrong with that. And that's supporting that child to achieve his or her full potential. In the United States, where we're competing globally, where we've got that migration rate of people coming in from other countries, taking jobs that our schools may not be preparing students for, we're in a different scenario. The National Matriculation Exam consists of exams in mother tongue, which is Finnish, second language, usually Swedish, foreign language, mathematics, and humanities. You have to pass 4 of the exams. I mentioned about the classes, 5 75 minutes, 7 45 minutes. There's a 15-minute break between classes. Students are basically just allowed to wander the halls. They've got couches set up for the students. Now, I want you to think about your high schools and if you would have that environment there. We had a difficult time in some of the presentations, especially after lunch, staying awake because the presentations weren't dynamic. Speakers were rather laid back, very, very quiet, very, very monotone. And you'll get a chance to see that in a second. Again, very different culture. Mandatory physical education, very sports-focused. Team development, ice hockey, skiing, basketball. Secondary school, approximate per pupil cost, $10,400. Again, roughly equivalent to New Jersey, maybe slightly on the low side. Parents are becoming much more demanding, and litigation is now becoming prevalent. So we all commented that if you go forward 10 or 15 years, are they still going to be able to say in that society that educators are trusted, and is that trust going to erode, and will that impact their level of achievement? They commented that in the U.S. we close non-performing schools, Finland develops them. They have no accreditation process, and the reason they don't have an accreditation process is because they felt that accreditation focuses more on a point in time, where you're basically looking at, okay, what do we need to do to get through this inspection, as opposed to what are we really focusing in on long term in terms of driving student achievement. One of the other major differences that falls into the accreditation piece, and it's a major difference that we have to contend with, they do not have Oprah. And I don't mean Oprah Winfrey. I mean the Open Public Records Act. The newspapers and the media do not have access to school performance on any type of tests or measures. Now, you think about that for a second, that's a huge difference. Because if you want to go to a culture of not being about competition, if you want to go to a culture about truly being about educating the child, it's very hard to do that when you pick up the newspaper and you're seeing all these metrics about how schools compare to one another. That doesn't exist in Finland. They just don't simply have access to it. So it's almost a wall or a guard against that type of inspection, that type of comparison, that frees up teachers, frees up educators to look more at the long term. Finnish teacher education. I'll let you read the major teaching categories. Very similar to the U.S. Elementary is focused on class instruction, grade level type instruction. Middle school, secondary education is focused more on subject area instruction. Key takeaways on that: there's a huge focus on teaching teachers how to teach, teaching them about pedagogy, teaching them about how to interact with students, teaching them about psychology, the psychology of learning. Entry to teaching is extremely competitive. Another major difference between here and the United States. Here, if you want to become a teacher, you go to a teaching college. There, only 10 to 15% of the applicants for a university to become a teacher are even accepted into the program. And it's not solely based on what you know academically and your performance in school. There's actually a significant interview process where they're actually sizing you up and saying, look, does this person have the chemistry, the makeup of what it takes to be a good teacher? They truly recognize teaching as a calling, as a gift, and it's not just about the pure knowledge piece and, well, I'm going to be a teacher because I want to be a teacher. They rely very heavily on the personality aspects of that. Principals and teachers are in the same union. They didn't see any issue with that. They didn't see any concerns. Again, very strong collaboration, very strong trust. So you probably have that ability to do that. I don't think we're probably in that same type of situation here in the United States. All teachers except kindergarten are required to have a master's degree. We had that discussion if they believed that that particular piece was significantly correlated to their student achievement. They didn't have any data to necessarily support that. But again, it fits into the whole culture that teachers are widely respected, and we're going to invest heavily into instruction. So what he showed us in a time-past graphic is basically the direct correlation between closing the income gap or closing the wealth gap between the wealthiest and the poorest in a nation, and the corresponding increase in student achievement that results. And I think that as NJSBA looks at the whole poverty piece and how that drives education, that's something that should seriously be taken into account, because it had a significant impact on Finland. And if you look again at how the U.S. moved, the U.S. basically moved linearly to equity. As their equity closed over the last 40 years, although it's only been on very little, their educational achievement has also increased. Same thing with Finland. They've made significant strides in closing that gap, and you've seen a huge increase in PISA scores that correspond. And you've got many of your high-performing educational countries all sitting in this block. So again, you look at Finland's success, you look at the equity piece, you look at a lesson like that, you really have to start to wonder how much of this really is quality instruction versus how much of this is the simple cultural background that they're a part of. To sum this up, there's some concepts here that don't cross the pond. The socialistic characteristics. You know, we're not Finland in terms of the government provides. The homogeneous population. We are certainly nowhere near that piece. We don't have the migration rate. We have Finland has limited mobility. We've got significant mobility, both internationally as well as interstate. We don't sort students. You know, every single one of our high schools could look in the paper significantly better in terms of their SAT and AP performance if we were able to select which students take the test. And in most of our high schools, any student who wants to take the test, they take the test. Overall international comparison rankings, when we talk about the corruption index, the happiness index, we're in a different spot than Finland. And operating in a non-Oprah world, significant difference between the two countries. What does translate? Equity first. And I think that that's something that the U.S. and us as leaders, as part of the Lee Group, really need to start looking at, is when you look at academic achievement, how much of this is based upon the wealth gap that we have. This was another key takeaway for us. Finland begins by making students responsible for their own learning. And Pasi Sahlberg said to us, it's funny because they begin by making students responsible, and in the United States, we're trying to solve the problems of public education by making teachers more accountable. And the question was raised, at what point is you increasing accountability? Is the pupil not responsible for anything at all? Because accountability is what's left when responsibility is taken away. And especially when you think about that concept, as educators on our own, without intervention from the state, if you look at education in the U.S. for the last 20 years, it went from that questioning, that concept of teacher in front of a room, putting knowledge in, and then a week later having the students regurgitate that knowledge and testing whether or not they know it. We've changed that model on our own over the last 20 years to be more student-centered learning, to be more about students collaborating with one another, to putting the student at the center of the learning process. And yet everything that's coming down upon us from externally is all about holding the teacher, holding the principal, and holding the school board more accountable. At what point do we shift that accountability piece to tie out to the change that we ourselves have implemented in the classroom, which says, look, the student and what the student is learning and how the student learns is the primary focus. Get the mission right. Are we about having the best school system, or are we about making sure every student achieves his or her full potential? Because again, depending on how you design it, how you frame the mission, it's going to drive a completely different set of actions. Teacher education, professional development, and a calling to the profession are essential. There's an opportunity probably for us to improve teacher education. Opportunity, and maybe something we should look at in the hiring process, is, are the people that we're hiring truly meant to be educators? Is it their personal calling? And like I said, teaching is a gift. It's a very hard profession. Not everyone has it. Finland focuses on how to teach. Subject matter is irrelevant. And finally, think long-term. One of the things that we're launching in our district, I've mentioned this several times, Vision 2030. 2030 is the year that our current kindergartners will graduate college. What will that world look like in 2030? And what can school boards, what can teachers and principals do today to be able to prepare them for 2030? And school boards need to be having those long-term conversations and thinking strategically about where we're going to go. And that's what Finland does very well. They think long-term. They're looking at the big picture in terms of where they want their educational system to go. So that is a highlight on my week in Finland.